morning. So my other two videos I did about stitching on full coverage. I told you I was going to try and record some actual stitching because I did have someone ask me to show them exactly what it is I do. So this is Wrecker Girls. This is one of the pieces that I mentioned I'm going to start stitching, or I'm going to try to stitch cross country, one color at a time per page. So I'm going to stitch an entire color on a page, then stitch the next color on that page until the page is complete, and then I'll move on. So this is very precariously set up. I don't have a proper tripod or anything, but I've got a phone kind of jerry-rigged above my stitching stand here. These are my threads that were parked previously. And as you can see, I've already started some stitching here. And basically, I just need to make sure that these are out of my way. So I'm just going to move them over underneath my chart. Normally, I would use probably a needle minder or something to pin them out of the way, but my chart's going to be laid there on top of it, so they're not going to be any nuisance to me. And these ones all do the same. I'll just move these out of the way. And I mean, you could always tuck them behind a needle minder if you wanted to. Okay. I have my chart here. So the next color that I've chosen to do is going to be this symbol here. And I've marked off all the instances of that symbol on the chart. These extra ones that are yellow, we're just going to ignore those. Those are the ones that are the parked threads that are still here. But all of these yellow ones, these are the ones that I'm going to stitch in. And I'm going to start with this one right here. And these are the ones that I stitched in last night. These two symbols here. In my last video I talked about when I'm going to do cross country, I will typically stitch a moderate, a symbol that has moderate coverage so that it gives me something to count from, because where I don't grid. Okay, so I stitched in these two symbols. This gives me lots of peppered area to stitch in around now and to count from. So I've already got my needle threaded here. I'm going to tuck my chart in there to the side. And starting with that first stitch I pointed out, that stitch is actually going in right here. So I'm stitching this on 18 count with 2 strands of floss, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit here as well. There we go. Try that, I guess. And so I always start my threads when I'm stitching with an even number of threads. If I'm doing 2 strands, with a loop start. So I double my thread, which gives me that loop on the end. Pull that through. Come back up through the loop and go back down through the same hole again. That pulls the loop down through my stitching. There we go. And then I just stitch like normal. It's really difficult to do this through the camera. Okay. Next stitch is going to be right here. So basically I'm counting from this one to find out my placement for the next one. So instead of counting in or down from grid lines, I'm just counting in or down from my previous stitching. Oops, I didn't put through the hole there. Again, really difficult to do this with the camera. So, as you can see, this doesn't really slow me down too much. And I like the fact that when I'm cross-country stitching, I'm just working with the one color of floss. So that's all I have taken out at the moment. I'll work until I get this color done, and then I'll switch and take out the next color. Oops. So I'll come back when I get this color stitched in just so you can see. Okay, so basically as I'm stitching, when I get to certain areas, I will just stop and count my stitches over to a stitch that's close to make sure that I'm still on track, to make sure that I haven't gone wrong somewhere, because you know, I wouldn't want to get to the end of my stitching of filling this in and then discover that I had counted wrong. So every once in a while as I'm coming down, I'll stop and I'll count, you know, my spaces, make sure that these two stitches are lining up with this one, or that these two stitches are lining up with these two stitches. You know, I'll just double check it against the stitches I already have put in to make sure it's okay. These waist knots that I have here, that's because I've ended a color, you know, that didn't have one next to it that I could weave my thread underneath, so I just left a waist knot. As I stitch and fill this here in, I'll snip those waist knots off once the tails are stitched over on the back of the fabric. So that's how I stitch cross country. I basically put in a moderate number of stitches, and then I'll go back and fill in, and I usually stitch the symbol that has the least number of stitches all the way up then through the symbol that has the most stitches. That way the one with the most stitches gets stitched last, and it covers in all of the little trailing threads on the back of my work. So now let's show you how I stitch on a full coverage piece where I'm using I'm stitching more in the row by row or column by column method with parking. Okay, so this is my old world map, and I've just very quickly thrown this on the frame to show you the stitching, so to bear with me again, this is not very steady, but it'll do. So I'm stitching this one 2/1 on 18 count Aida again. But on this one, I'm using parking. So I've been stitching in blocks and parking underneath. So I have all these lovely threads. And to speed it up so I wouldn't have to flip my work over all the time, when I need to end a thread, I've been starting using the loop method, but I've been ending with waist knots down below. So as I move across and this gets stitched down, I will snip these waist knots and just have the park threads left in that row. As you can see, like this row here is just parked threads, but this row here is waist knots, and then as I stitch these down, these waist knots will get snipped off. Okay? So these park threads, again, I would just move those out of the way because my chart would sit here. And this is the area I'm going to be working on now. I'm just going to show you the corner of this chart because, again, this is a Heaven and Earth design, and I don't want to get into any copyright issues here, but so just this corner right here, these 4 squares correspond to this blank space here. Okay? This is 4 10 by 10 blocks right here that I need to stitch in. So these threads that I've parked are all the little yellow dots on my paper. You can see that very well there. It's all the yellow dots on the paper. And I will stitch those in first, and then I will add in the other threads. So I'm going to see if I can, it's the best way for me to put this. Okay, bear with me one moment. Okay, so these threads here that are parked in the bottom square, I parked these down here because there was no instance of them occurring here. As you can see, they were probably coming across from this last block here. I'm just going to put those down here out of the way and hold them down there. These ones here, I'm basically going to separate them at just about the page break, which is going to be about, not the page break, sorry, the square break, which is going to be about here. And I'm going to put these ones this way just so they're out of the way. And again, you could pin those with a needle minder or pin them underneath your chart, what have you. I'm just going to lay them there. These ones here, these are the ones we're going to start stitching with. Oops, sorry about the camera shake there. I was getting my needle. Actually, these belong over here as well. Yep. Okay. There we go. So these are the ones we're going to start with. I'm going to start with this one right here. I pick up the thread. I thread my needle, because I don't keep 100 different needles threaded at any given time. So thread my needle very quickly there, as quick as I can anyway. And I'm going to put in this first stitch right here. And I tend to hold my strands out of the way if I'm coming up through a hole that already has a strand in it, just so that I'm not nicking into it or piercing it with my needle. So that's my first stitch in. I'm now scanning the square, the 10 by 10 block, to see if there's another instance of that particular color or that stitch. And I don't, yes I do have one. It's further down, and it's going to be down here. So I'll put that in here. Again, scanning my chart now to see if there's another instance of that color. And there is, but it's down in the next square. So I will end up parking this thread now further down. And it happens to be, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4. happens to be down from this one. Right there. And you can't see that because it's out of frame, isn't it? But I've parked that thread now. So I'm just going to highlight it very quickly there on my chart. And we'll do the next color. The next color is going to be this one here. We'll do the same thing. Pick up the thread, thread the needle, when my fingers want to work. There we go. And we'll put in this one. And then just scan the chart for any other instances of that color. And it's actually going to be, right here, just down from these two parked threads. And all I do is when I'm doing this, I'm just using my opposite hand because I two-handed stitch to move those parked threads out of my way. Because someone had asked me how I stitch around the parked threads, and that's pretty much it. I just move them out of the way as I'm going. And two more here. So that's basically all you're doing with this method, is you're just putting in your stitches in between your parked threads until you get these parked threads worked in. Now, how I learned to park, I use Carolyn Mazzio's parking tutorial, and I will link that down below for you as well. And I'll also link my video that I did for waist knots. Okay, that's that one. Down 2 stitches. Really hard to do this through the camera, my goodness. Now here's an instance where this stitch is the end of my 10 by 10 block, but there's stitch in this 10 by 10 blocks. This is one over here, this is another one here. This stitch is in the second 10 by 10 block. I will go ahead and stitch it. Some people just stitch in a strict column and they wouldn't bleed over into the next one. I always do. And the reason I do that is because I don't want harsh column lines in my stitching. So if there is an instance where I have to cross over what normally would be, if I had grid lines, there would be a grid line right in the middle of these 2 stitches going straight up and down here. Okay, but I'll bleed over into the next column so that I avoid those, I avoid any ridges or lines left in my stitching. This waist knot is in the way of the corner of a stitch. I basically do the same thing as I do with the other ones. I'll just put my stitch in And then I'll snip off the waist knot after. Sometimes I'll snip it off before. And that's pretty much it. One more stitch of this color, which goes right here. Now this color is done. There's no instance of it in the square below, so I'm going to end this one off with a waist knot. So basically I'm going to come down to here, come up through my fabric, like so. Now some people just weave it back down and pull it back up again, and don't bother to tie a knot. Because I rotate my pieces and I'm not confident that the thread is not going to slip out when it's not on my frame, I just tie a little knot. Easy as that. And then I just snip off that little end and leave the knot there. And when I get down through, I'll tie that off. So that's how I stitch with my threads all over the place. I would then go back now and pick up the next color. Now some people wouldn't drop down to the next row. You know, this stitch that's blank here, for example, they would choose that color next and fill that one in because they start at the top of the square and work their way to the bottom of the square. I tend to fill in my park threads first and then go back and fill in the blank squares that are left over. As you can see, this square right here, my park threads have all been worked in, and I just need to go back now and fill in these ones that are left over. I hope that helps.